A gavel crashes down like a death sentence in the oppressive silence of a courtroom. For Judge Richard Brennan, it's just another Wednesday, another woman to throw away, another life to destroy without consequence. The black woman in handcuffs standing before him, Destiny Williams, is nothing. Less than nothing, invisible, a statistic he'll forget before his next coffee break. But Brennan has made a catastrophic mistake. He believes he is untouchable, that his black robe makes him a god, that he is the master of this domain and the arbiter of all fates. He doesn't know that his courtroom is an active crime scene, that his gavel is a weapon of mass destruction, and that the woman he's about to sentence is the one person who can burn his entire corrupt world to ashes. Before we dive into this incredible true story of justice and revenge, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. You won't want to miss how this unfolds. Trust me, what happens next will leave you speechless. The city of Riverside was a patient dying from a malignant tumor. On the surface, it gleamed with civic pride and economic progress. But underneath the polished veneer, a cancer had spread, poisoning every institution it touched. At the heart of this decay was a name whispered only in fear and desperation: Malcolm, the architect, Durant. He ran the city's criminal underworld with cold, calculating precision. But his true power didn't come from the barrel of a gun or the threat of violence. It came from the stroke of a pen and the slam of a gavel in courtroom 6A, presided over by the so-called Honorable Judge Richard Brennan. For 3 long years, the FBI's elite task force on organized crime and human trafficking had been trying to build an airtight case against Durant. They had cooperating witnesses, thousands of hours of surveillance footage, financial records, and mountains of circumstantial evidence. But every single time they got close to taking him down, the case would mysteriously implode in court. Witnesses would suddenly recant their sworn testimony. Critical evidence would be deemed inadmissible on the flimsiest of technicalities, and key players would walk free, smirking at the cameras. The leak wasn't coming from the police department. It wasn't coming from the prosecutor's office. It was coming from higher up, much higher. It was the judge himself. This is where Deputy Director Diana Cole came in. To the world, she was the newly appointed second-in-command of the FBI's Criminal Investigative Division, a woman known for her brilliant strategic mind, her unwavering integrity, and her absolute refusal to let corrupt officials escape justice. But to the streets of Riverside, she was about to become someone entirely different, someone powerless, someone vulnerable, someone invisible. She was about to become Destiny Williams, and she was walking straight into the lion's den. For Mary. The fluorescent lights in the FBI's secure conference room buzzed with a monotonous hum that matched the tension crackling through the air. Diana Cole stood at the head of the polished oak table, her hands pressed flat against the cool surface, her eyes fixed on the file that had consumed her every waking moment for the past 6 months. The manila folder was worn at the edges, opened and closed so many times that the paper had gone soft. Inside was a photograph of a young woman with bright eyes and an infectious smile, Mary Cole. Age 24, wrongfully convicted, dead in prison under circumstances the official report called suspicious but inconclusive. Diana's sister. Across from her sat Assistant Director Marcus Reeves, a man who'd been her mentor for 15 years and the closest thing to family she had left. His face was carved with concern as he studied the proposal she'd just laid before him. Next to him, SAC Jennifer Park from the Organized Crime Unit shook her head slowly, her expression somewhere between admiration and disbelief. "Diana," Marcus began, his voice careful, measured. "What you're suggesting is unprecedented. We've never sent someone of your rank into deep cover. The risk factors alone would fill a book." "The risk is exactly why it has to be me," Diana replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. "Durant's network is too sophisticated. They can spot a regular agent from a mile away. They have informants, facial recognition software, access to law enforcement databases. But they won't be looking for me. They won't expect the FBI's deputy director to walk into their trap willingly." Jennifer leaned forward, her fingers drumming against the table. "We've been trying to build this case for 3 years, Diana. Every single prosecution that's made it to Brennan's courtroom has fallen apart. We know he's dirty. We know Durant owns him. But we can't prove the connection. The offshore accounts are too well hidden, the money trail too complicated. Which is why we need someone on the inside," Diana said, opening the folder and spreading out a series of photographs. Look at these women. 31 cases in the past 3 years alone. All women of color. All arrested by the same two officers, Beck and Torres. All prosecuted in Brennan's courtroom. All convicted. And look at the sentences. 20 years average for first-time offenders on possession charges. This isn't justice. This is trafficking with a legal stamp of approval. She pulled out another photograph, this one of her sister, younger, laughing at a family barbecue. The image was 5 years old, taken 2 months before Mary's arrest. Before everything fell apart, Mary was one of them, Diana continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I didn't see it then. I was so focused on my career, on climbing the ladder, that I didn't pay attention to the details of her case. She told me she was innocent. She begged me to look into it. And I told her to trust the system, to serve her time, that justice would prevail. Diana's hand curled into a fist. Justice didn't prevail. She died in that hellhole, and the official report says it was suicide, but Mary didn't kill herself. She was murdered because she knew too much, because she was asking too many questions about the other women who'd vanished. The room fell silent except for the relentless buzz of the lights. Marcus stood, walked around the table, and placed a hand on Diana's shoulder. If we do this, if we actually green-light this operation, there's no safety net. We can't risk pulling you out early. You'll have to go through the entire process. Arrest, booking, trial, even conviction and sentencing. If Brennan or Durant suspect for even a second that you're FBI, you won't just be compromised, you'll be dead. I know the risks, Diana said, meeting his eyes. I've spent 6 months studying every case, every pattern, every detail. Beck and Torres target women who fit a specific profile. Black or Latina, no strong family connections, history of economic struggle, perceived vulnerability. They plant drugs during traffic stops, always during convenient body cam malfunctions. The women are processed through the system like cattle, assigned overworked public defenders who don't have the resources to fight. Brennan railroads them through show trials, and then they disappear into a system where some of them are funneled directly into Durant's trafficking operation. She pulled out a map of Riverside, marked with red pins indicating arrest locations, yellow pins for the courthouse, and black pins for the women's detention center. I've already created the identity. Destiny Williams, no family, no permanent address, working minimum wage jobs, the perfect victim. I've rented a room in the Riverside district, the same area where Beck and Torres operate. I know their patrol schedule. I know how they work. Jennifer stood, walking to the window that overlooked the Potomac River. The water was gray under the overcast sky, reflecting the weight of the decision before them. You're asking us to watch you be arrested, watch you be abused by the system, watch you be convicted and sentenced to decades in prison. And we have to do nothing. We have to let it happen. Yes, Diana said simply, because that's the only way to gather the evidence we need. Once I'm inside, I'll have access to the other women, to the guards, to the patterns. I'll be able to document everything from the inside. And when the moment is right, when Brennan sentences me in open court, that's when we strike. We arrest him on the bench. We execute simultaneous raids on Durant's operations. We bring down the entire network in one coordinated move. Marcus returned to his seat, pulling the proposal toward him and reading through it again with the careful attention of a man who'd spent 30 years in the Bureau. You've thought of everything, he admitted. Cover story, extraction protocols, surveillance coordination, legal justifications. This is the most detailed undercover proposal I've ever seen. But Diana, there's one thing you haven't addressed. What this will do to you personally. You're going to experience every form of systemic abuse that Mary experienced, every indignity, every violation, every moment of powerlessness. Can you maintain your cover through that? Can you suppress your training, your authority, your identity, and truly become Destiny Williams? Diana closed her eyes, seeing Mary's face in the darkness behind her eyelids. Mary's voice echoing in her memory. That last phone call from prison. The desperation and fear that Diana had dismissed as dramatics. I have to, she said, opening her eyes. For Mary, for the 47 other women who've been destroyed by this system, for every woman who'll be targeted next if we don't stop this. She pulled out one final document, a handwritten letter in Mary's shaky script, dated 3 days before her death. They're going to kill me, it read. I figured out where the women go. There's a place. A warehouse on the east side. Judge Brennan picks which ones. Diana, please. You have to believe me. Tell someone. Stop them." Diana had received the letter 2 days after Mary's funeral. It had taken her 6 months to trace the connections, to understand the full scope of what her sister had discovered. And now, she was going to finish what Mary had started. "We have a saying in the Bureau," Marcus said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of command. "Sometimes to catch a monster, you have to walk into its lair. But Diana, once you cross that threshold, there's no turning back. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want?" Diana looked at Mary's photograph one last time, memorizing every detail of her sister's smile, then closed the folder with a sense of finality that echoed through the room like the slam of a gavel. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life. They won't see me coming. And when it's over, when Brennan is in handcuffs and Durant's empire is ashes, Mary's death will finally mean something." The decision was made. In 6 weeks, Deputy Director Diana Cole would cease to exist. In her place would be Destiny Williams, a nobody, a ghost, a perfect victim. And she would walk willingly into the machinery designed to break women like her, carrying with her the one thing that Brennan and Durant could never anticipate: the truth, and the patience to wait for the perfect moment to deploy it. The transformation was about to begin. 8 weeks. That's how long it took for Diana Cole to die, and for Destiny Williams to be born. The transformation didn't happen overnight in a makeup chair or with a simple change of clothes. It was a methodical dismantling of everything Diana had built over 15 years at the FBI. Every habit of authority, every mannerism of power, every unconscious signal of confidence and control. She had to learn how to be invisible in a way that went deeper than appearance. She had to become genuinely powerless. The first cut was literal. Diana sat in a discount salon in the Riverside district, watching in the smudged mirror as cheap scissors hacked away the carefully maintained locks she'd worn for a decade. The stylist, a tired woman who barely looked at her, asked no questions and offered no conversation. When it was done, Diana's hair was cropped close to her scalp, practical and anonymous. She paid in cash, left no tip because Destiny Williams wouldn't be able to afford one, and walked out into the humid evening air feeling strangely lighter and infinitely more vulnerable. The apartment she'd rented was a single room on the 4th floor of a building that smelled of cooking oil and mildew. The walls were thin enough that she could hear every argument, every television program, every crying baby in the neighboring units. There was a hot plate but no stove, a bathroom she shared with 3 other tenants, and a window that looked out onto an alley where stray cats fought over garbage. Diana had lived in Spartan conditions during her academy days, had endured hardship on operations across 3 continents, but this was different. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't training. This was the reality that millions of women lived every single day, and for the first time in her privileged career, she was experiencing it without the safety net of her badge or her rank or her government salary. She found work at a commercial laundromat, the kind of place where people dropped off bags of dirty clothes and paid by the pound. The owner, a man named Mr. Kowalski, who smelled of cigars and disappointment, hired her on the spot when she said she'd work for minimum wage, cash, no questions. Her shift started at 6 in the morning and ended whenever the last load was done, usually around 7 at night. She scrubbed stains, folded towels, and listened to the stories of women who came in, with children hanging off their hips and exhaustion carved into their faces. "You new around here?" one woman asked, a Latina mother of 3, who always came in on Tuesdays. "I haven't seen you before." "Just moved," Diana replied, keeping her voice soft, her eyes down. This was Destiny talking, not Diana. "Looking for something affordable." The woman laughed, a sound without humor. "Affordable? That's a nice way of saying cheap and dangerous. You be careful in this neighborhood, especially at night. The cops around here, they're worse than the criminals." Diana filed that away, another data point in the massive map she was building in her mind. Every conversation was intelligence. Every interaction was reconnaissance. She carried a small notebook that she kept hidden in her room, documenting times, patterns, observations. Officer Beck and Officer Torres patrolled this sector between 8 in the evening and 4 in the morning, 4 nights a week. They had a routine, a rhythm. She began to see it. The harassment started in the 2nd week. Diana was walking home from the laundromat, her feet aching in the cheap sneakers that were all Destiny could afford, when a car slowed beside her. Not a police cruiser, just a civilian vehicle with two men inside who leered at her through the open window. "Hey baby, where you going? Need a ride?" Diana's instinct was to respond with the authority she'd wielded for years, to pull out credentials that didn't exist anymore, to remind these men that she was federal law enforcement and their behavior constituted harassment. But Destiny Williams had no authority. Destiny had no power. So Diana did what Destiny would do. She kept her eyes forward, walked faster, and felt the flutter of genuine fear in her stomach as the car continued to follow her for 2 more blocks, before finally driving away with laughter echoing from the windows. She made it back to her apartment, locked the door with shaking hands that were only partially performance, and sat on the edge of her mattress trying to metabolize what had just happened. Mary had lived like this. Mary had endured this casual violence, this constant low-grade threat, this knowledge that her body was seen as public property by men who believed they had the right to comment, to touch, to take. The realization hit Diana like a physical blow. All those times Mary had called her, frustrated and frightened, and Diana had offered platitudes about being strong, about not letting it get to her. She hadn't understood. She hadn't known. Now she knew. The work at the laundromat gave her a window into the ecosystem of the neighborhood. She observed the rhythms of poverty, the calculations women made about which bills to pay and which to let slide, the way they shared resources and information in a network of mutual survival. She saw the women who came in with bruises they didn't explain, the ones who washed clothes in water that was too hot, as if they could scald away whatever had been done to them. And she began to hear the stories about the justice system, whispered between folding tables like urban legends, except they were all true. "My cousin got picked up last year," one young woman confided during a slow afternoon. "Said the cops planted drugs on her. She's doing 15 years now. Can you believe that? 15 years for something she didn't do." "What was her name?" Diana asked carefully. "Rosa Martinez. She had a little girl only 5 years old. The grandmother's raising her now." Diana added the name to her mental list. Rosa Martinez was case number 17 in Brennan's courtroom. Convicted despite the complete absence of any prior record, any history of drug use, any logical explanation for why a single mother working 2 jobs would suddenly start dealing narcotics. The pattern was undeniable once you knew to look for it. She started following Beck and Torres during their patrol. Not obviously, not in a way that would draw attention, but she mapped their routes, their stops, their interactions with the community. They worked in tandem like predators who'd perfected their hunting strategy over years of practice. Beck was the aggressor, the one who did most of the talking, whose body language broadcast threat and dominance. Torres was quieter, more methodical, the one who handled the technical aspects, who knew exactly when to disable a body camera and how to make it look like a malfunction rather than a deliberate act. She watched them stop a woman on the corner of Riverside and Fifth, saw the aggressive posture, the intimidation tactics, the way they searched her bag with invasive thoroughness while passers-by looked away, unwilling to become involved. The woman was released this time, sent on her way with a warning that sounded more like a threat, but Diana saw the calculation in Torres's eyes, the assessment being made. That woman was being evaluated for future targeting. She fit the profile. One night, Diana witnessed them pull over a young black woman driving an older model Honda. The stop happened just after 11 o'clock, in a poorly lit section of the district where there were no businesses, no foot traffic, no witnesses except Diana, who watched from the shadows of a closed storefront. The woman's hands were shaking as she handed over her license and registration. Beck leaned into the window, his flashlight pointed directly at her face, blinding her while Torres walked around the vehicle, trying door handles, peering into windows. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," Beck ordered, his tone leaving no room for question. The woman complied, her voice trembling as she asked what she'd done wrong. Beck didn't answer. Instead, he had her place her hands on the hood while he conducted a pat-down that was aggressive and invasive, his hands lingering in places that had nothing to do with searching for weapons. Diana's jaw clenched as she watched, every instinct screaming at her to intervene, to stop this abuse, to remind these men that they were supposed to protect and serve, but she couldn't. Not yet. So she watched, memorized, and waited. Torres opened the woman's trunk, rummaged through it with latex-gloved hands, then suddenly called out, "Hey Beck, look at this." Diana couldn't see what Torres had found, or more likely planted, but she saw the woman's face go pale with terror, saw her start to protest. saw Beck place a hand on his weapon in a gesture of intimidation that made the woman go silent and still. 20 minutes later, the woman was in handcuffs, being placed in the back of their cruiser, while Torres filled out paperwork on the hood. Another victim, another number, another life about to be destroyed by a corrupt system that was supposed to deliver justice. Diana returned to her apartment that night and added every detail to her documentation. The time, the location, the vehicle description, the woman's approximate age and appearance. Her FBI team was monitoring from a distance, collecting data, building the parallel case that would eventually corroborate everything Diana gathered from the inside. But watching from a distance was clinical, detached. Living it was something else entirely. She lay on her thin mattress, staring at the ceiling where water stains bloomed like flowers of decay, and felt the weight of what she was about to do settle over her like a shroud. Tomorrow or the next day or the day after that, she would deliberately position herself to become Beck and Torres's next target. She would allow them to stop her, to plant evidence on her, to arrest her, and drag her into the machinery that had destroyed Mary. And she would do it knowing that once the process began, there was no stopping it, no escape, no rescue until the very end. But tonight, she was still Diana Cole, still in control, still the hunter preparing to walk into the trap. She pulled out her phone, one of the few possessions that Destiny Williams wouldn't have, and sent a brief encrypted message to Marcus. Ready. Initiating contact within 72 hours. His response came back immediately. We'll be watching. God be with you. Diana deleted the messages, removed the battery from the phone, and wrapped it in plastic before hiding it in a hollowed-out section of the baseboard that she'd prepared weeks ago. Destiny Williams was about to become real, and in 72 hours, Diana Cole would cease to exist. The night was cold for early October, the kind of damp chill that seeped through cheap fabric and settled into bones. Diana walked down Riverside Avenue at exactly 9:15, her canvas backpack slung over one shoulder, her breath forming small clouds in the amber glow of the streetlights. She'd timed this carefully, researching Beck and Torres's patrol patterns, until she could predict their movements with near certainty. They would be coming down this street in approximately 8 minutes. She would be visible, alone, vulnerable, perfect prey. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a rhythm that was only partially manufactured. This was real fear, the kind that came from knowing exactly what was about to happen and choosing to walk into it anyway. She was voluntarily surrendering every advantage she'd spent 15 years cultivating. Her authority, her connections, her ability to call for backup. In 8 minutes, she would be completely at the mercy of 2 corrupt police officers who had no idea that the woman they were about to target was an FBI deputy director. The irony would have been amusing if the stakes weren't so terrifyingly high. She rounded the corner onto 5th Street, a stretch of road that ran past a closed automotive shop and a 24-hour convenience store with bars on the windows. There were no other pedestrians, no cars except for a single sedan parked near the convenience store with its lights off. Diana's trained eyes cataloged everything. The security camera above the store entrance that had been broken for 6 months, the alley to her left that offered no escape route, the distance to the nearest phone that Destiny Williams wouldn't have money to use anyway. Headlights appeared behind her, moving slowly, too slowly. Diana didn't turn around, didn't alter her pace, didn't give any indication that she noticed. She was Destiny Williams now, a woman walking home from work, tired and thinking about nothing more than getting off her feet and maybe eating something before collapsing into bed. Not a federal agent who could identify the make and model of the vehicle by its headlight pattern, who'd already memorized its license plate number in the brief glimpse she'd allowed herself in a storefront window. The patrol cruiser pulled alongside her, and Diana felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. This was it. The point of no return. "Hey there, miss," Officer Beck called out through the open passenger window. His voice was friendly, almost jovial, but Diana heard the undercurrent of threat beneath it. "Little late to be walking alone, isn't it?" Diana stopped, turned, kept her face neutral and her eyes slightly downcast. Destiny Williams would be cautious, but not aggressive, careful not to give these men any excuse to escalate. "Just heading home from work, officer," she said quietly. "Only a few blocks from here." "Work, huh?" Beck opened his door and stepped out, his hand resting casually on his belt near his weapon. Not quite touching it, but close enough to remind Diana that he was armed and she was not. "What kind of work you do?" Laundromat. Over on Riverside. Diana gestured vaguely in the direction she'd come from, keeping her movements slow and non-threatening. Every instinct she'd developed over 15 years in law enforcement screamed at her to assess threat levels, to position herself defensively, to take control of the situation. She suppressed all of it. Destiny Williams had no training, no tactical awareness, no power. Torres emerged from the driver's side, circling around the front of the cruiser with the predatory grace of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. "You got ID on you, ma'am." "Just routine, you understand." Diana nodded, reaching slowly into her jacket pocket and pulling out the driver's license she'd obtained 6 weeks ago. Destiny Williams, age 32, address in the Riverside district. No wants, no warrants, completely clean. She handed it to Torres, who examined it with his flashlight while Beck moved closer to her, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly intentional. "Destiny Williams," Torres read aloud. "You new to this neighborhood, Destiny?" "About 2 months," Diana replied. "Like I said, just trying to get home." "Well, see, that's the thing," Beck said, his tone shifting subtly toward something more aggressive. "We've had a lot of drug activity in this area lately. Lot of dealers moving product through here. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Diana's pulse quickened. Here it came, the setup, the manufactured probable cause. "No, sir, I don't know anything about drugs. I work, I go home. That's it." "Mind if we take a look in your bag?" Torres asked, though his tone made it clear this wasn't really a question. "Just to make sure everything's on the level." I guess that's okay," Diana said, letting her voice waver just enough to sound uncertain but not defiant. Destiny Williams wouldn't know that she had the legal right to refuse this search. Wouldn't understand that without probable cause, these officers had no right to search her belongings. Or if she did know, she'd be too intimidated to assert those rights. Torres reached for her backpack, and Diana handed it over, watching as he placed it on the hood of the cruiser. Beck moved to stand slightly behind her, close enough that she could feel his presence, a tactic designed to prevent her from seeing exactly what Torres was doing. This was when it would happen. This was when they would plant the evidence. "Let's see what we've got here," Torres said, unzipping the main compartment. He pulled out her work uniform, a cheap paperback novel she'd been pretending to read during her lunch breaks, a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in plastic. He set each item on the hood methodically, making a show of the search. Then his hand dove deeper into the bag, and when it emerged, it was holding a small plastic baggie filled with white powder. Diana's breath caught, genuine shock mixing with performance. She knew this was coming, had prepared for this exact moment, but seeing it happen was still viscerally disturbing. "What? What is that? That's not mine. I've never seen that before." "No?" Beck's voice was cold now, all pretense of friendliness gone. "This was in your bag, ma'am. Your bag that you've been carrying. Are you telling me someone else put this here?" Diana let her hands start to shake. It wasn't difficult. The adrenaline coursing through her system was real, the understanding that she was now completely committed to this course of action. "That's not mine. I swear, I don't know how that got there. Please, you have to believe me." Torres was already pulling out his radio, but before he spoke into it, Diana saw him glance at his watch. 9:43. She knew what was coming next because she'd studied the pattern in dozen other cases. In exactly 30 seconds, Torres would reach up and adjust his body camera in a way that would accidentally deactivate it. The malfunction would last approximately 4 minutes, long enough for them to complete the arrest and book the evidence without any video record of this crucial moment. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12, Torres said into the radio. "We've got a 29 Victor at 5th and Riverside. Need a warrant check and transport." "Right on schedule." Torres reached up and fumbled with his body camera. Diana heard the small beep that indicated it had been switched off, though he would later claim in his report that it was a technical malfunction, the same malfunction that seemed to affect both officers' cameras at precisely the same moment with stunning regularity. "Destiny Williams, I'm placing you under arrest for possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute," Beck said, pulling handcuffs from his belt. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Diana felt the cold metal close around her wrists, felt the click of the cuffs being tightened just a touch more than necessary, felt the complete loss of autonomy that came with being physically restrained. This was what Mary had experienced. This sudden transformation from citizen to suspect, from person to property of the state. "Please," she said, letting tears well up in her eyes. Some were performance. Some were absolutely genuine. "I didn't do anything. I work at a laundromat. I don't sell drugs. I don't even know any drug dealers. Please, there's been a mistake." "Save it for the judge, sweetheart," Torres said, guiding her toward the back of the cruiser with a hand on her arm that was just rough enough to leave marks. "You'll have your chance to tell your story in court." Diana was placed in the back seat, the door closing with a finality that echoed like a gunshot. Through the wire mesh that separated the back from the front, she watched Beck and Torres pack her belongings back into her bag. Everything except the baggie of drugs, which Torres carefully placed in an evidence bag with exaggerated care. They were performers in a routine they'd perfected, two corrupt officers playing their roles for the cameras that weren't running and the witness who was now their prisoner. The drive to the county detention center took 20 minutes. Diana sat in silence, her mind racing through everything that was about to happen. Booking, processing, the waiting, the dehumanization. She'd studied the procedures, read accounts from other women who'd been through this system, but knowing about something intellectually was different from experiencing it physically and emotionally. They pulled into the secure entrance of the detention facility, a sprawling concrete structure that looked more like a factory than a place meant to house human beings. Beck opened her door and pulled her out with unnecessary force, making her stumble slightly as her feet hit the pavement. "Come on, let's go. You got a long night ahead of you." Inside, the fluorescent lights were painfully bright, reflecting off the scuffed linoleum floors and cinder block walls painted in that particular shade of institutional beige that seemed to exist nowhere else in the world. A corrections officer behind a desk didn't even look up as Beck and Torres brought Diana in, just slid a clipboard across the counter for them to fill out. "Female detainee. Possession with intent. Caught with approximately 2 ounces, Torres said, his voice bored now that the excitement of the arrest was over. "She's all yours." The corrections officer finally looked up, her eyes scanning Diana with the kind of assessment that reduced a person to a checklist of characteristics. "Empty your pockets. Remove your shoes, belt, and any jewelry. You'll get a receipt for your personal property." Diana complied, moving slowly because her hands were still cuffed. Everything she owned in this identity, everything that was Destiny Williams, was placed in a clear plastic bag and sealed. Her fake ID, her $37 in cash, her cheap watch. The corrections officer wrote out a receipt in handwriting that was barely legible and handed it to Diana without making eye contact. "Hands forward for fingerprinting." Diana extended her cuffed hands, felt the ink rolled across her fingertips, pressed her prints onto the card. Then came the photographs, full face and profile, the flash leaving spots in her vision. She was given a number, 78352. From this moment forward in the system, she wasn't Destiny Williams, woman who worked at a laundromat and had hopes and dreams and a life however modest it might be. She was 78352, female detainee, possession with intent. Beck and Torres left, their part in this transaction complete. They would file their reports, identical in every detail, because they'd told the same lie so many times they no longer needed to coordinate their stories. The drugs would be entered into evidence, the body camera malfunction would be noted as an unfortunate technical issue, and one more woman would be fed into the machine that Judge Richard Brennan operated with ruthless efficiency. Diana was escorted down a long corridor by a female corrections officer who looked as tired as every other person who worked in this building, through heavy steel doors that clanged shut behind them with sounds that echoed like judgments being passed. Into a holding cell where 5 other women sat on metal benches, all of them wearing the same expression of exhausted resignation. One woman looked up as Diana entered, her eyes meeting Diana's for a brief moment. Something passed between them, an understanding that needed no words. "We are the same now. We are caught in the same machinery. We are all just numbers waiting to be processed." Diana sat down on the cold metal bench, her wrists still aching from the handcuffs that had been removed only moments before. She closed her eyes and thought of Mary, of that last phone call, of the desperation in her sister's voice. "I'm here, Mary," Diana thought. "I'm inside. And I'm going to finish what you started. I promise." The trap had been set. Diana had walked into it willingly. And now there was nothing to do but wait for the machinery to grind forward, to carry her deeper into a system that had been designed to break women exactly like her, except Diana Cole wasn't broken. She was a weapon concealed as a victim, and when the time came, she would detonate. The Riverside Women's Detention Center smelled of disinfectant and despair. Diana spent her first night in a cell designed for 4 people but currently housing 7, where the air was thick with the sounds of crying and coughing and whispered conversations between women who'd learned to find comfort in shared misery. She lay on a thin mattress that smelled of industrial cleaner and tried not to think about how many other bodies had pressed against this same foam, tried not to calculate the statistical probability of bedbugs or worse. At 6 in the morning, a corrections officer shouted that it was time for breakfast. Diana shuffled in line with the other women, still wearing the clothes she'd been arrested in because the intake process hadn't been completed yet. She was handed a plastic tray with something that might have been eggs, and something else that might have been meat, and a piece of toast that had the consistency of cardboard. She sat at a long table and forced herself to eat because Destiny Williams couldn't afford to look like someone who was fasting by choice. An hour later, her name was called. Not her name, her number. 78352. Report for processing and arraignment preparation. Diana stood, smoothed down her wrinkled shirt, and followed another corrections officer through a series of corridors that all looked identical, painted the same soul-crushing beige, lit by the same harsh fluorescent lights that made everyone look jaundiced and ill. She was strip-searched by a female officer who performed the procedure with mechanical efficiency, neither cruel nor kind, just thoroughly and completely indifferent to Diana's humanity. Diana stood naked in a room that was too cold, raised her arms, lifted her feet, opened her mouth, felt the violation of having every part of her body examined and catalogued. This was necessary, she told herself. This was what Mary experienced. This was what every woman in this system experienced. The indignity was the point. After the search came the orange jumpsuit, one size fits all, which meant it fit no one properly. Diana rolled up the sleeves and cinched the waist with the provided belt, then was led to another waiting area where she saw a young Asian man in an inexpensive suit carrying a briefcase that looked older than he was. "Destiny Williams?" he asked, consulting a legal pad. "I'm James Chen, from the Public Defender's Office. I've been assigned to your case." They met in a small room with a metal table and 2 chairs bolted to the floor. Janet sat down and spread out a file that was remarkably thin for something that would determine the next decades of Diana's life. He looked tired in the way that suggested he hadn't had a good night's sleep in months, maybe years. "I've got about 8 minutes before they call your name for the arraignment," he said, his voice carrying the hurried tone of someone who had 23 other cases to deal with today. "So let's make this quick. You're charged with possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute. According to the police report, they found approximately 2 ounces of cocaine in your bag during a routine stop. You have any priors?" "No," Diana said quietly, "and that cocaine wasn't mine. The officers planted it." Chen didn't even pause in his review of the paperwork. "Everyone says that, Miss Williams. I need something more specific to work with. Did they have probable cause to search your bag? Did you consent to the search? Were there any witnesses?" No. Yes. Diana let her voice falter, let herself sound uncertain and overwhelmed, which wasn't difficult because even though this was all part of the plan, the reality of sitting in this room in this orange jumpsuit was more intense than she'd anticipated. "They asked to search my bag and I said okay because I thought if I didn't consent they'd just do it anyway and maybe get aggressive. There were no other people around. And I'm telling you, whatever drugs they found, they put them there. I work at a laundromat. I don't have anything to do with drugs." Chen looked up from his notes, and for the first time, Diana saw something shift in his expression, a flicker of real attention, of genuine engagement beyond the mechanical processing of another case. "The officers who arrested you, Beck and Torres." "Yes, those were their names on their badges." Something darkened in Chen's eyes. "Beck and Torres," he repeated slowly. "And the search happened at what time?" "Around 9:45 at night, I think. I'd just gotten off work." Chen wrote something down, underlining it twice. "I'm going to be honest with you, Miss Williams. Your bail hearing is in front of Judge Brennan. He's not sympathetic to defendants in drug cases, especially not in cases brought by Beck and Torres. I'll argue for reasonable bail, but you should prepare yourself for the possibility that he'll deny it and remand you to custody until trial." "I can't stay here," Diana said, letting real desperation creep into her voice. I'll lose my job, my apartment. I didn't do anything wrong." "I believe you," Janet said, and the sincerity in his voice surprised Diana. "I've seen Beck and Torres's cases before. Their arrest reports are always perfect, too perfect. But believing you and proving you're innocent are two different things, and the system doesn't really care about the difference." Before Diana could respond, a corrections officer opened the door. "Chen, they're calling your case. Courtroom 3. The courtroom was smaller than Diana had expected, and more crowded. She was led in shackled to a line of other defendants, all of them wearing the same orange jumpsuits, all of them being processed through the system like products on an assembly line. Janet positioned himself at the defense table while a young prosecutor who looked barely out of law school stood at the prosecution table reviewing files. Then Judge Richard Brennan entered, and the room fell silent with a hush that spoke of fear more than respect. He was exactly as Diana had seen him in photographs and surveillance footage. Florid complexion, expensive suit under his black robes, an expression of permanent disapproval carved into his features. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged, never been questioned, never been held accountable. "All rise," the bailiff intoned unnecessarily because everyone was already standing. Brennan sat, gestured for everyone else to sit, and began working through the arraignment calendar with the kind of mechanical efficiency that made it clear he'd done this thousands of times, and saw no reason to waste time on individual consideration. Case after case was called, bail was set or denied, and defendants were shuffled back to holding cells to await trials that might not happen for months. Then Diana heard her number called, her fake name spoken aloud by the bailiff. 78352, Destiny Williams, charged with possession, with intent to distribute. Diana stood, felt Jane Tries beside her, felt the weight of Brennan's gaze settle on her like something physical and oppressive. "Miss Williams," Brennan said, his voice dripping with disdain, "another unfortunate young woman led astray by the plague of narcotics that infects our community. What do we know about Miss Williams?" The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, the defendant was arrested last night by officers Beck and Torres with approximately 2 ounces of cocaine in her possession. She has no prior record, no known employment, and no substantial ties to the community. The state requests remand without bail." "No employment?" Janet stood quickly. "Your Honor, my client works at a laundromat. She has a residence in the Riverside district. She's never been arrested before in her life. She maintains her innocence and has every intention of appearing for trial. We request reasonable bail." Brennan barely glanced at Janet before returning his attention to Diana. His eyes traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl, not sexual but somehow worse, assessing and dismissing her value as a human being in a single look. "Women like you," Brennan said slowly, "are a blight on this community. You come here with no roots, no family, no responsibility, and you peddle poison to our children. You expect this court to believe that you're gainfully employed at a laundromat while carrying 2 ounces of cocaine? This court has heard that story before, Miss Williams, and it holds no water." "Your Honor," Janet interjected, "my client is presumed innocent until proven guilty. She's never been convicted of any crime. To deny her bail before she's even had a chance to defend herself against these charges is—" "Counselor," Brennan's voice cracked like a whip, "you will address this court with appropriate respect and refrain from telling me how to interpret bail statutes that I've been applying since before you were born. The defendant is a flight risk. She has no meaningful ties to this community. Bail is denied. Remand to custody pending trial." The gavel came down with a sound that Diana would hear in her nightmares for years afterward. Not loud, but final, absolute, the sound of power being wielded without check or balance. Janet was still trying to object, but Brennan had already moved on to the next case, dismissing Diana's entire life and future with the same casual indifference he might show to swatting a fly. Diana was led out of the courtroom, back down the corridors, back to the holding cell, but before she was processed into the general population, she caught a glimpse of Chen's face as he gathered his papers. He looked angry, which surprised her. She'd expected resignation, the professional detachment of someone who'd seen this play out hundreds of times. Instead, she saw fury, and something else. Determination. The cell they assigned her to was in Block D of the Riverside Women's Detention Center, a section that housed pre-trial detainees who were awaiting their court dates. It was marginally less grim than the intake holding cells, with 4 bunk beds instead of metal benches, a toilet that had a partial privacy screen, and a tiny window high up on one wall that let in a square of natural light for about 2 hours each afternoon. Diana's cellmates were a rotating cast of women caught in the same machinery, though none of them knew yet that some would never make it out. There was Shanice, 19 years old and terrified, arrested for shoplifting and unable to make the $500 bail that was the difference between freedom and indefinite incarceration. There was Maria, a mother of 3 whose kids were now in foster care while she waited for a trial on charges of writing bad checks to pay for her daughter's insulin. And there was an older woman, maybe 50, who sat on her bunk and said nothing, just stared at the wall with eyes that had seen too much and survived too little. The days blurred into a monotonous routine of bad food and worse conditions. Diana observed everything, memorizing the rhythms of the facility, the guards who were sadistic, and the ones who were merely indifferent. The women who'd been here so long they'd developed their own hierarchies and systems of control. She was looking for something specific, evidence of the pipeline that Mama G had mentioned in her sister's letter, signs of women being selected and transferred to facilities that didn't exist. She found it on her 4th day. The women's recreation area was a concrete yard surrounded by chain-link fence topped with razor wire. It was where detainees were allowed 1 hour per day of what the facility called outdoor time, though the experience felt more like being in a dog run than anything recreational. Diana sat on a metal bench and watched the patterns, the groups that formed and dissolved, the hierarchies being negotiated through glances and body language. That's when she noticed the older woman from her cell sitting alone at a table, working on something that looked like paperwork from a distance. Diana approached casually, not wanting to draw attention from the guards who watched from elevated platforms, with an attention that varied between vigilant and bored depending on their mood. "Mind if I sit?" Diana asked. The woman looked up, her eyes shrewd despite the exhaustion that lined her face. "Free country," she said, though her tone suggested she knew this was a lie. Or it used to be, anyway. Diana sat, keeping her posture open and non-threatening. "I'm Destiny. Just got here a few days ago." "I know who you are," the woman said. "Gloria Henderson, but everybody calls me Mama G. Been in this place so long I've seen 3 wardens come and go. You got that look about you." "What look?" "The look that says you're seeing things, really seeing them, instead of just surviving them. That look gets women in trouble around here." Mama G's eyes flicked toward a guard and then back to Diana. "Or it gets them killed. Depends on what they do with what they see." Diana felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind. "I lost someone to this system," she said quietly. "My sister. They said she committed suicide in prison, but I don't believe it. She was looking into something, asking questions about where women were going after they got sentenced." Mama G was quiet for a long moment, her hands still on the papers she'd been reviewing. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Your sister was smart to ask questions. Stupid to do it where the wrong people could hear. You want to know what she found out?" "Yes." "Then you better understand something first. Destiny, or whatever your real name is. The judge, Brennan, he's not just corrupt, he's evil. He's part of something bigger, something that's been running for years. He picks women that nobody will miss, women with no family, no resources, no voice. He convicts them on fake charges, gives them sentences that are way too long, and then some of them just disappear. Transferred to facilities that, when you look them up, they don't have any record of them being there." "Where do they go?" Diana asked, though she already knew the answer. She needed to hear it confirmed, needed Mama G to say it out loud. "Wherever Durant needs them," Mama G said simply. "Malcolm Durant, the man who really runs this city. Some of the women end up in his prostitution network, some in his drug operations. The young ones, the pretty ones, they get shipped overseas, human trafficking dressed up in legal paperwork and judicial stamps. Nobody looks twice at a convicted felon being transferred between facilities. And by the time anyone realizes they're missing, if anyone even notices, there's no trail to follow." Diana forced herself to stay calm, to process this information like Destiny Williams would process it, with horror but not with the clinical analysis of an FBI deputy director. "How do you know all this?" "Because I've been watching for 15 years, honey. Watching and documenting and waiting for someone to care enough to do something about it. Your sister, Mary, she was one of the smart ones. She figured it out, started asking the right questions. Then she died, and it wasn't suicide no matter what the report said. That was a message to the rest of us. Keep your mouth shut or end up the same way. The guard called out that recreation time was over. Women began shuffling back toward the building, a line of orange jumpsuits moving with the defeated posture of people who'd learned that resistance was futile. Diana stood slowly, her mind racing through the implications of what Mama G had just confirmed. "Why are you telling me this?" Diana asked. Mama G looked at her with eyes that held depths of pain and an ember of hope that 15 years in this system hadn't quite managed to extinguish. "Because you got that look. The look that says maybe, just maybe, you're different. Maybe you're the one who won't just survive this, but who'll do something about it. Your sister tried. She failed. But maybe you won't." Diana wanted to tell her the truth right then. Wanted to say that she was FBI, that this was all part of a plan, that justice was coming. But she couldn't risk it. Not yet. So she just nodded and followed the line of women back into the building, carrying with her the confirmation she needed and the weight of knowing that every day she waited, more women were at risk. That night, lying on her bunk while her cellmates snored and whispered and wept, Diana stared at the ceiling and counted the days until her trial. James Janathad told her it would be approximately 4 weeks, which in the civilian world seemed like a long time, but in the compressed reality of the justice system was actually remarkably fast. 4 weeks to gather more evidence from the inside, 4 weeks to document everything, 4 weeks until she would face Judge Richard Brennan in his courtroom and let him believe he was destroying another powerless woman. And then, in that moment of his greatest arrogance, she would detonate. 4 weeks passed in the grinding monotony of incarceration. Diana used every moment to gather intelligence, building relationships with the other women, learning the patterns of the guards, documenting everything in her memory since she had no way to write it down. James Janet visited 3 times, each time bringing more evidence of the pattern he'd uncovered. 31 cases, all women of color, all arrested by Beck and Torres, all convicted in Brennan's courtroom, all receiving sentences far beyond what the charges should warrant. "I can't use most of this in court," Janet told her during their last pretrial meeting, frustration evident in every word. "Brennan will rule it inadmissible as irrelevant to your specific case. But Destiny, I want you to know that I believe you. I've seen enough to know that what's happening here is systematic, deliberate, and absolutely corrupt." Diana looked at him across the scarred metal table in the attorney visitation room and saw something that gave her hope, even in this dark place. Janeth hadn't been broken by the system yet. He still believed that the law could be used for justice instead of oppression, still had the fire that came from genuine outrage at injustice. She wished she could tell him that everything he suspected was true and that help was coming, but she couldn't risk the exposure. So she just nodded and said, "Thank you for believing me. It means more than you know." On the morning of her trial, Diana was processed through a series of checkpoints, strip-searched again because that was procedure, and given a set of civilian clothes that Janathad brought for her. Navy blue slacks and a white blouse, both slightly too large, both deliberately chosen to make her look respectable and sympathetic. She changed in a cell under the watchful eye of a corrections officer, then was handcuffed and led through the tunnel that connected the detention center to the courthouse. Courtroom 6A was larger than the arraignment room, with rows of wooden benches for spectators, a jury box that could seat 12, and an elevated bench where Judge Richard Brennan would sit in judgment like a king on his throne. Diana was brought in through a side entrance and seated at the defense table next to Chen, who was reviewing his notes with the frantic energy of someone who knew he was fighting a losing battle but refused to surrender. The courtroom filled slowly, a handful of spectators, mostly students from the local law school who came to watch trials as part of their education. A court reporter who set up her machine with efficient movements born of thousands of hours of practice. The prosecutor, an older man named Walsh who had the polished appearance and casual confidence of someone who'd never lost a case in Brennan's courtroom because Brennan made sure he never lost. Then came the jury selection, and Diana watched with the trained eye of someone who'd testified in dozens of trials as the 12 people who would decide her fate were chosen through a process that was supposed to be fair, but was anything but. Janet tried to challenge the exclusion of every person of color, every woman who showed any hint of sympathy for defendants, but Brennan overruled him again and again with barely concealed contempt. By the time the jury was seated, it was composed of 9 white people, 2 Asian individuals, and one Latino man who looked like he desperately wished he was anywhere else. Not a single black person. Not a single person who looked like they might understand what it meant to be targeted by a system that saw you as guilty from the moment you were born. Judge Brennan entered last, and the bailiff called out for all to rise. Brennan swept in with his black robes billowing, sat down with the satisfied air of a man who owned this room and everything that happened in it, and looked out at the assembled court with eyes that catalogued and dismissed in equal measure. "The People versus Destiny Williams," the bailiff announced. "Case number 573928. "Is the prosecution ready?" Brennan asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Walsh stood. "Ready, Your Honor." "Defense?" Chen stood. "Ready, Your Honor." "Then let's proceed with opening statements. Mr. Walsh." Walsh approached the jury box with the smooth confidence of a salesman who'd made this pitch so many times he could do it in his sleep. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a straightforward case. On the night of October 15th, Officers Beck and Torres, two decorated members of our police force, stopped the defendant during a routine patrol. They had every reason to believe she was engaged in illegal activity. When they searched her bag, they found approximately 2 ounces of cocaine, a quantity consistent with drug dealing rather than personal use. The evidence will show beyond any reasonable doubt that Destiny Williams is guilty of possession with intent to distribute, and I ask that you return a verdict that reflects the serious nature of this crime. Thank you." He sat down, and Brennan nodded approvingly before turning to Chen. "Defense counsel?" Chen stood, and Diana could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped his legal pad just a little too tightly. He was nervous, she realized. Nervous and outgunned, and aware that he was about to try to hold back an avalanche with his bare hands. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client Destiny Williams is innocent," Janet began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "This case isn't about drugs, it's about power. It's about who has it and who doesn't. Destiny Williams is a woman who works at a laundromat for minimum wage. She has no criminal record, no history of drug use, no connections to any drug organizations. She was walking home from work when she was stopped by officers who claimed to have found drugs in her bag. But the evidence will show that there are significant problems with that story. Problems with the timeline. Problems with the so-called malfunctioning body cameras that conveniently stopped recording during the crucial moments of the search. Problems with a pattern of similar arrests that raise serious questions about what really happened that night. I ask you to listen carefully to the evidence, or rather, to the lack of evidence, and to remember that the burden of proof rests entirely on the prosecution. If there is reasonable doubt, and I promise you there will be, then you must find my client not guilty. Thank you." Brennan's expression during Chen's opening statement was one of barely contained irritation, as if he were being forced to sit through a child's tantrum. "Call your first witness, Mr. Walsh." "The People call Officer Frank Beck." Beck entered from the hallway, tall and solid in his dress uniform, every inch the professional law enforcement officer. He was sworn in, took the stand, and settled into his testimony with the ease of someone who'd done this many times before. Walsh walked him through the events of October 15th, with questions that were carefully designed to elicit exactly the responses he wanted. "Officer Beck, can you describe what drew your attention to the defendant that night?" "My partner and I were on patrol in the Riverside District, an area known for high drug activity. We observed the defendant walking alone at approximately 9:15. Her behavior seemed nervous, evasive. When we approached to conduct a welfare check, she appeared extremely anxious." Diana wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, nervous and evasive because she'd been walking while black in a neighborhood that Beck and Torres treated as their personal hunting ground. But Destiny Williams couldn't laugh, so Diana stayed silent and watchful. "And what happened next?" "We identified ourselves as police officers and asked if we could speak with her. She said she was coming from work, heading home. I asked if we could search her bag to ensure there were no weapons or contraband. She consented to the search." "And what did you find?" "Approximately 2 ounces of cocaine, packaged in a manner consistent with street-level distribution." Walsh held up an evidence bag containing the drugs that had been planted in Diana's backpack. "Is this the substance you recovered?" "Yes, sir, it is." "Thank you, Officer Beck. Your witness, Mr. Chen." Chen stood, and Diana could see him gathering himself, preparing for a cross-examination that would test every skill he'd developed in his years as a public defender. "Officer Beck, you testified that my client appeared nervous and evasive. Can you describe specific behaviors that led you to that conclusion? She was walking quickly, glancing around, typical behavior of someone who's engaged in illegal activity. Walking quickly. At night. In a neighborhood you yourself described as having high crime. Isn't it possible that she was walking quickly because she wanted to get home safely? Objection, Walsh said lazily. Speculation. Sustained, Brennan ruled without even looking at Chen. Chen didn't let it deter him. Officer Beck, your body camera footage from that night shows the first part of the stop, but then there's a gap of approximately 4 minutes where both you and Officer Torres's cameras were not recording. Can you explain that? Beck shifted slightly in his seat. Technical malfunction. It happens sometimes with the equipment. Interesting. Can you tell me how often your body camera has malfunctioned in the past year? I'm not sure of the exact number. Would it surprise you to learn that according to the maintenance records I subpoenaed, your camera has malfunctioned 18 times in the past year, and in 16 of those cases, the malfunction occurred during searches that resulted in drug arrests? Objection. Walsh was on his feet. Your Honor, this line of questioning is irrelevant to the current case. Sustained. Mr. Chen, confine your questions to the facts of this specific case. Chen's frustration was evident, but he pressed on. Officer Beck, at what time did you and Officer Torres arrive at the scene of the stop? 9:15 approximately. And at what time did you report the arrest to dispatch? 9:53. 38 minutes for a routine traffic stop that you claim was straightforward. Can you explain why it took so long? We had to secure the scene, conduct the search properly, process the evidence, and ensure officer safety. Officer safety? Was my client threatening in any way? She was agitated, but not violent, not aggressive, just scared. I would characterize her demeanor as suspicious. Suspicious, Janet repeated. Thank you, Officer Beck. No further questions. Officer Torres's testimony was a mirror image of Beck's, rehearsed and perfect in every detail. Janet tried the same tactics, got the same rulings from Brennan, and sat down with the defeated air of someone who knew he was being prevented from mounting a real defense. The forensic expert who testified about the cocaine was perfunctory, confirming that yes, it was cocaine. Yes, it weighed approximately 2 ounces. Yes, the packaging was consistent with distribution. Janeth had no meaningful way to challenge the physical evidence because the physical evidence was real. The drugs had been real. The planting of them was the crime, but proving that was impossible when the judge controlled every aspect of what evidence could be admitted. The prosecution rested after 2 hours of testimony. Brennan looked at Janet with barely concealed contempt. Does the defense wish to present a case? Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Destiny Williams. Diana stood, felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom settle on her, and walked to the witness stand with her head held high. She was sworn in, placed her hand on a Bible that had been touched by thousands of other hands making the same promise to tell the truth, and sat down in the chair that felt more like an electric chair than a seat of justice. Chen approached her with visible care, as if she were made of glass and might shatter. Miss Williams, can you tell the jury in your own words what happened on the night of October 15th? Diana took a breath. Let Destiny Williams's voice emerge, frightened but determined. I was walking home from my job at the laundromat. It was late, around 9:15, and I was tired. I just wanted to get home. Then the police car pulled up next to me, and the officers got out. Officer Beck asked me where I was going, and I told him I was going home. He asked to see my ID, and I gave it to him. Then Officer Torres asked if he could search my bag, and I was scared to say no, so I said yes. He put my bag on the hood of the car, and Officer Beck stood behind me so I couldn't really see what was happening. Then Officer Torres said he found drugs, but I swear on everything I hold dear, those drugs were not mine. I have never used drugs. I have never sold drugs. I work at a laundromat for minimum wage. That's it. That's my life. Did you see Officer Torres put anything in your bag? No, because Officer Beck was blocking my view. But I know what was in my bag when I left work, and there were no drugs. Thank you, Miss Williams. Your witness, Mr. Walsh. Walsh approached the stand like a shark that had just detected blood in the water. Miss Williams, you testified that you work at a laundromat. What's the name of this laundromat? Riverside Clean Laundry. And how much do you make there? Minimum wage. About $300 a week. $300 a week. That's not much, is it? Must be hard to pay rent, buy food, cover all your expenses on that kind of money. Diana saw where he was going. It's difficult, yes, but I manage. Do you live alone? Yes. No family support? No one helping you out financially? No. So when you say you manage, what you really mean is that you're barely surviving, living paycheck to paycheck, struggling to make ends meet. Objection, Janet said. Argumentative. Overruled, Brennan said. The witness will answer. Yes, Diana said quietly. It's a struggle. Walsh moved in for the kill. Miss Williams, isn't it true that a woman in your situation, desperate for money, might be tempted to make some extra income through illegal means? No, I would never. You would never? Really? Because according to your own testimony, you're barely getting by. 2 ounces of cocaine could be sold for what, several $1,000s? That's a lot of money for someone making $300 a week. I didn't have any cocaine. But you did, Miss Williams. The officers found it in your bag. Your bag that you admitted was in your possession all night. How do you explain that? They planted it. They must have put it in my bag when I wasn't looking. Oh, of course. The police planted evidence. The police, who have no reason to target you, who were just doing their jobs, somehow decided to risk their careers and their freedom to frame a woman they'd never met before. Does that really sound likely to you? Diana wanted to scream that yes, it was exactly what happened, that Beck and Torres had done it to dozens of other women, that this entire trial was a sham, but she couldn't. Destiny Williams didn't have that information, didn't have that knowledge. So she just said, I don't know why they did it. I just know they did. Walsh turned to the jury with a theatrical gesture. Miss Williams, isn't the truth that you were caught red-handed with cocaine, and now you're trying to blame the police because you have no other defense? No, Diana said, her voice breaking just enough to sound genuine. That's not the truth. The truth is, I'm innocent. No further questions. Walsh sat down with the satisfied air of someone who knew he'd just destroyed the defense's only witness. Chen tried to rehabilitate her on redirect, asking about her work history, her clean record, her lack of any connection to drug activity, but the damage was done. The jury looked at her with the same skeptical expressions that they'd worn throughout the trial, the look of people who'd already made up their minds. After closing arguments where Walsh painted Diana as a desperate drug dealer and Janet made a passionate plea about reasonable doubt that fell on deaf ears, the jury was sent to deliberate. They were gone for 18 minutes. 18 minutes to decide the next 20 years of someone's life. When they returned, the foreman stood and announced the verdict that Diana had known was coming from the moment Brennan walked into the courtroom. We find the defendant, Destiny Williams, guilty of possession with intent to distribute. The words hung in the air like smoke. Chen's hand found Diana's shoulder, squeezing gently as if he could somehow transfer strength through that touch. Diana sat perfectly still, her face a mask of devastated acceptance that hid the cold fury burning beneath. She looked at Judge Brennan, saw the satisfaction in his eyes, and thought, not yet, but soon. Sentencing will be immediate, Brennan announced. Miss Williams, please stand. Diana stood, Janet beside her, and faced the judge who believed he held all the power in this room. Destiny Williams, Brennan began, leaning forward with relish. You are a perfect example of what plagues our society. Women like you, with no moral compass, no respect for law and order, no regard for the damage you inflict on our communities. You prey on the vulnerable, you poison our streets with your filth, and you contribute nothing of value to civilization. You are a parasite, Miss Williams, and this court will ensure that you can do no more harm. Therefore, it is the sentence of this court that you serve no less than 20 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 12 years. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none. The gavel came down, and Diana Cole smiled. Your Honor, Diana said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence that had followed Brennan's pronouncement. I would like to make a statement before this sentencing is finalized. Brennan looked at her with obvious annoyance, but protocol and his own arrogance wouldn't allow him to deny this request. Defendants always wanted to make statements before sentencing, pleas for mercy that he enjoyed crushing. By all means, Miss Williams, one last performance for the court. Though I warn you, nothing you say will change this sentence. "Oh, I think you'll find that's not quite accurate, Your Honor." Diana straightened in her chair, and something fundamental shifted in her posture. The defeated slump vanished. The downcast eyes lifted. Her shoulders pulled back with a confidence that hadn't been visible throughout the entire trial. Even her voice changed, dropping the uncertain tremor of Destiny Williams and taking on the crisp, authoritative tone of someone accustomed to command. Chen looked at her with confusion and growing alarm. The jury stirred in their box. Brennan's expression darkened with irritation. "Thank you for allowing me to speak, Your Honor. But before I begin, I should probably correct you on one small detail. My name is not Destiny Williams. That name was a cover identity, carefully constructed over the past several months for the specific purpose of penetrating your operation." The courtroom went completely silent. Even the court reporter's fingers stopped moving over her machine. "My actual name is Diana Cole. I am the Deputy Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Criminal Investigative Division." For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then chaos erupted. The jury gasped collectively. Walsh half stood from his chair, then sat back down. Chen's mouth fell open, and Judge Richard Brennan's face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock, disbelief, fury, settling finally on something that looked disturbingly like fear. "Bailiff." Brennan's voice cracked across the courtroom like a whip. "Restrain the defendant. She is clearly suffering from some kind of mental breakdown. Remove her from my courtroom immediately." "I don't think you want to do that, Judge Brennan," Diana said calmly, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Because this isn't a breakdown, this is a debriefing. And if you'll permit me just a few more minutes, I think you'll find what I have to say very enlightening." She turned to face the gallery, where the law students and random spectators were now leaning forward with rapt attention. "For the past 12 weeks, I have been living undercover as Destiny Williams. I deliberately positioned myself to be arrested by Officers Beck and Torres. I allowed drugs to be planted in my bag. I submitted to this trial knowing exactly how it would end, because I needed to document, from the inside, how this corrupt system actually operates." Walsh found his voice. "Your Honor, this is clearly a desperate attempt to—" "To what, Mr. Walsh?" Diana turned her gaze on the prosecutor. "To avoid a sentence that you and I both know was predetermined? Let me share some facts that might interest this court. Officer Beck, you testified that you observed me engaging in suspicious behavior at 9:15 on the night of October 15th. Specifically, you said I was walking quickly and glancing around in a manner consistent with criminal activity." She produced a small photograph from the pocket of her jacket, a movement that made the bailiff step forward, hand moving toward his weapon. "Relax, officer. It's just a photograph, taken from a convenience store security camera at 9:47 on October 15th. That's me, purchasing a bottle of water and a candy bar, 3 blocks away from where Officer Beck claimed to have observed me at 9:15. Beck, still sitting in the gallery where he'd been waiting to hear the sentence imposed on his latest victim, had gone pale. "But that's a minor inconsistency compared to the real evidence," Diana continued. "Officer Torres, you testified that both your body cameras malfunctioned during the critical 4 minutes of the search. Specifically, you claimed it was a technical glitch, the kind of thing that just happens with electronic equipment. Except it wasn't a technical glitch, was it, Officer Torres? The internal diagnostic log from your body camera, which my team subpoenaed from the manufacturer, shows that the camera was manually disabled at exactly 9:43 p.m., not a malfunction. A deliberate action. And Officer Beck's camera shows the exact same pattern, disabled at 9:43, reactivated at 9:47, 4 minutes. Just enough time to plant evidence and complete an arrest." Torres was on his feet now, backing toward the courtroom doors. 2 men in dark suits who'd been sitting quietly in the back row stood simultaneously, blocking his exit. "The narcotics that Officer Torres claimed to find in my bag," Diana said, her voice gaining momentum like a prosecuting attorney building to a closing argument, "were tested by my forensic team. They carry a very specific chemical marker, batch number 7734B, which happens to be part of a shipment that was seized from one of Malcolm Durant's stash houses 2 months ago. Evidence that was logged into police custody and then mysteriously disappeared. Evidence that somehow ended up being used to frame me and dozens of other women." She turned back to Brennan, who was gripping his gavel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. But, Your Honor, this isn't really about Beck and Torres, is it? They're just the hired help. The real architect of this operation sits right there on that bench, hiding behind a black robe and the illusion of judicial authority. You will be silent, Brennan roared, slamming his gavel down repeatedly. Bailiff, I ordered you to remove this woman. She is in contempt of court. Actually, Your Honor, she's a federal law enforcement officer conducting an official investigation, said a new voice from the back of the courtroom. A woman in her early 40s wearing an FBI windbreaker walked down the center aisle, her credentials held high. Special Agent Jennifer Park, FBI. And Deputy Director Cole is absolutely correct. You don't want anyone removed from this courtroom right now. This is absurd. Brennan was standing now, his face flushed dark red. I am a sitting judge. You have no authority in my courtroom. With respect, Your Honor, this stopped being your courtroom about 30 seconds ago, Diana said. For the past 3 years, you have presided over 31 cases involving women of color arrested by Beck and Torres on fabricated drug charges. 31 women who were railroaded through show trials in this very room. 31 women who received sentences averaging 19.4 years for crimes they didn't commit. And the reason you did this, the reason you perverted the justice system you swore to uphold, is sitting in offshore account CY984722, receiving monthly deposits of $50,000 from 3 shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands. She pulled out another document, this one, a printout of financial records. Corporations that, when you trace them back through 6 layers of legal fictions, are owned by Malcolm Durant. The same Malcolm Durant who runs the largest human trafficking operation in the tri-state area. The same Malcolm Durant whose criminal enterprise depends on having a steady supply of vulnerable women. Women with no families, no resources, no one to notice or care when they disappear into his network. These are lies, Brennan shouted, but his voice had lost its authority. He sounded frightened now, desperate. Fabrications. I will have your badge for this, Director Cole. I will see you prosecuted for fraud, and— You'll see nothing, Diana interrupted, except the inside of a federal prison cell, because, Judge Brennan, you are under arrest. The main courtroom doors burst open with a crash that echoed like thunder. A dozen FBI agents in full tactical gear poured into the room, weapons drawn, moving with the practiced efficiency of a team that had rehearsed this operation dozens of times. The bailiff reached for his weapon, then froze as 3 agents bracketed him with their own firearms. FBI, nobody move! The lead agent, a muscular man with graying temples, moved directly toward the bench. Richard Brennan, you are under arrest for racketeering, conspiracy to commit human trafficking, money laundering, obstruction of justice, deprivation of rights, under color of law, and about 15 other federal charges that we're still compiling. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Brennan stood frozen, his gavel still clutched in one hand, his face cycling through expressions of rage and terror and disbelief. You can't do this, he whispered. I'm a judge. I'm a judge. Not anymore, you're not, Diana said quietly. She looked at the jury, all 12 of them sitting in stunned silence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I apologize for the deception, but it was necessary. The system that was supposed to protect people like Destiny Williams has been corrupted by men like Judge Brennan. He turned the courtroom into a pipeline, funneling innocent women into Malcolm Durant's criminal empire. My sister was one of those women, Mary Cole. She was convicted in this very courtroom 5 years ago on fabricated charges. She died in prison 3 months into her sentence, and the official report called it suicide. But Mary didn't kill herself. She was murdered because she discovered what Brennan and Durant were doing. Diana's voice caught slightly, the first real emotion she'd shown breaking through the professional demeanor. This entire operation, which we've named Sister's Keeper, was designed to gather evidence that could bring down not just Brennan and Durant, but the entire network of corruption that has infected this city's justice system. Every word spoken in this courtroom over the past 3 days has been recorded. Every piece of evidence has been documented. And at this very moment, FBI teams are executing search warrants at Judge Brennan's residence, his office, and approximately 27 other locations connected to Durant's organization. Agent Park stepped forward, holding up her radio so the entire courtroom could hear. All teams, Report status. Static crackled, then voices began reporting in rapid succession. Team 1, Durant's waterfront compound secured. Target in custody. Team 3, warehouse on East Industrial. Multiple victims recovered, requesting immediate medical and social services support. Team 7, Judge Brennan's residence clear. Evidence collected, including documents and electronic devices. Diana looked at Brennan as agents moved toward the bench, handcuffs ready. You told me I was a parasite, Your Honor. You said I contributed nothing of value to civilization. But you know what I actually am? I'm a federal agent who just spent 12 weeks documenting every detail of your criminal enterprise. I'm a sister who kept the promise she made to another sister. And I'm the last person you ever should have underestimated. 2 agents reached the bench, and Brennan finally seemed to understand that this was really happening, that his world was actually collapsing around him. He tried to back away, to retreat into the chambers behind his courtroom, but there was nowhere to go. Agent Park was already there, blocking his escape. Your Honor, she said with heavy irony on the title, you need to come with us, and I'd advise you not to resist. We really would prefer not to have to drag a sitting judge out of his courtroom in handcuffs, but we absolutely will if necessary. Brennan's resistance crumbled. His shoulders slumped. The gavel fell from his fingers and clattered on the bench with a sound of absolute finality. An agent stepped behind him and secured his wrists with handcuffs, the same handcuffs that had been used on Diana just hours before. The symmetry was poetic. As Brennan was led past the defense table, he looked at Diana with pure hatred. This won't stand, he hissed. I have connections. I have lawyers. I'll fight this, and I'll win. And when I do, I'll make sure you spend the rest of your life regretting this. Diana met his eyes without flinching. You're welcome to try, Judge Brennan. But I should warn you, we have 3 years of financial records, testimony from 12 cooperating witnesses, including several of your former bailiffs, recorded phone conversations between you and Durant, and documentation of 47 wrongful convictions that you orchestrated. Oh, and we have Beck and Torres in custody as well. They're already negotiating for deals, which means they're racing to see who can give us more information about your operation. So good luck with that defense. Brennan was dragged away, still protesting, still threatening, still refusing to accept that his reign was over. Beck and Torres were arrested moments later, both of them being led out in handcuffs past the jury that had just convicted an FBI deputy director on fake charges. James Janet was still sitting at the defense table, his face a mask of absolute shock. Diana turned to him with an apologetic smile. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you the truth, Mr. Chen. But for what it's worth, you're an excellent attorney. The way you fought for me, even when you thought I was just another defendant with no power and no hope, that takes real courage. This city needs more lawyers like you. Chen found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. You were FBI the entire time? The arrest, the detention, the trial, all of it was. All of it was real, Diana said. I was really arrested, really locked up, really put through a trial designed to convict me regardless of the evidence. The only difference is that I knew it was coming and I chose to walk into it anyway. Because sometimes the only way to catch monsters is to become their prey. The courtroom was emptying now, agents escorting out everyone except the core FBI team, and a few observers who were frantically taking notes, already planning the news stories that would dominate headlines for weeks. Diana stood, stretched muscles that were stiff from 12 weeks of sleeping on prison bunks, and looked around the courtroom that had been the scene of so many injustices. It's over, Agent Park said quietly, standing beside her. We got them all. Brennan, Durant, Beck, Torres, 3 assistant prosecutors who were taking bribes, 5 court administrators who falsified records, and a network of guards at the detention center who facilitated the trafficking. Operation Sister's Keeper is complete. No, Diana said, thinking of Mama G and all the other women still locked up on fake charges. It's not complete yet. Now comes the hard part. Now we have to undo the damage. Every case needs to be reviewed. Every wrongful conviction overturned. Every woman who was victimized by this system needs to be freed and compensated. That's going to take months, maybe years. But we'll do it, Park said firmly. Because that's what justice actually looks like. Not a gavel and a robe and a rigged system, but real accountability, real consequences, real change. Diana nodded, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling over her like a heavy blanket. 12 weeks of maintaining a cover identity while enduring systemic abuse had taken a toll that she was only beginning to process. But there would be time for that later. For now, she had one more thing to do. She walked out of the courtroom, past the news cameras that were already setting up in the hallway, past the clusters of FBI agents coordinating the next phase of the operation, and found a quiet corner where she could make a phone call. She dialed a number she'd memorized years ago, the direct line to the office that had once been hers before she disappeared into this operation. "Director Reeves," Marcus answered, his voice tense with the controlled stress of someone who'd been monitoring this operation from the moment it started. "It's done, Marcus," Diana said simply. "Brennan's in custody. Durant's in custody. The entire network is falling apart." There was a long pause. Then she heard something that sounded suspiciously like a exhale of relief. "Good. That's good, Diana. How are you holding up?" "Ask me again in about a week, after I've slept for 72 hours straight and processed what just happened. But Marcus, it was worth it. Mary's death meant something. All those other women, their suffering wasn't in vain. We stopped them." "You stopped them," Marcus corrected gently. "Don't forget that. You were the one who walked into that hell voluntarily. You were the one who endured everything they could throw at you and came out the other side with enough evidence to bury them all. That took courage that most agents will never have to muster." Diana closed her eyes, feeling tears threaten for the first time since this entire operation began. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were something else. Relief, vindication, justice. "I need to go," she said. "There's someone I need to visit." She ended the call and walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon sun that seemed brighter somehow, cleaner, as if the world itself had been washed clean by what had just happened. Tomorrow she would start the work of reviewing cases and freeing the innocent. Tomorrow she would begin the long process of rebuilding a justice system that had been corrupted from within. But today, she was going to visit Mary's grave and finally tell her sister that the promise had been kept. The aftermath of Judge Brennan's arrest played out across national news for weeks. The story had everything: corruption at the highest levels, an undercover FBI operation, a dramatic courtroom reveal, and the rescue of dozens of trafficking victims. Diana Cole became the face of federal law enforcement integrity, though she tried to deflect attention to the victims and the systemic reforms that needed to happen. The interrogations began within hours. Beck and Torres, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of spending the rest of their lives in federal prison, turned on each other and on everyone above them in the food chain. Beck confessed first, laying out in excruciating detail how the operation worked: the targeting of vulnerable women, the coordinated body camera malfunctions, the evidence planting, the kickbacks they received for every successful arrest. Torres followed 2 hours later, adding details about the trafficking pipeline and how Brennan would mark certain women for special processing, which meant they would be transferred to facilities that existed only on paper before disappearing into Durant's network. Malcolm Durant was arrested at his waterfront compound while trying to delete files from a computer server. The FBI's cyber forensics team recovered everything anyway. The files contained a database that made Diana's blood run cold. Names, photographs, identifying information for over 200 women who'd been processed through Brennan's courtroom over the past decade. Some were marked as active inventory. Others were marked depleted or disposed of. Each entry represented a life stolen, a person reduced to property, a woman who'd trusted the system to deliver justice and instead received only horror. The warehouse raids recovered 23 women and girls, ranging in age from 16 to 34. They were in various states of physical and psychological trauma, some having been held for weeks, others for years. Diana visited them in the secure facility where they were receiving medical care and counseling, needing to see for herself that they were safe, that the operation had actually saved real lives and not just gathered evidence for prosecutions. One young woman, no more than 20, looked at Diana with haunted eyes and asked, "Are we really free? Or is this just another trick?" Diana had to swallow hard before she could answer. "You're really free, I promise. And the people who did this to you are going to prison for the rest of their lives." The federal trials moved forward with ruthless efficiency. Brennan tried to fight the charges, hired a team of expensive lawyers who argued that he'd been entrapped, that the FBI had violated his civil rights, that the evidence should be excluded on various technical grounds. None of it worked. The evidence was too extensive, too well documented, too damning. video recordings of him accepting cash payments from Durant's couriers, phone records showing hundreds of calls between his personal cell and known trafficking operations, bank records tracing the offshore accounts back to him through multiple layers of corporate shells. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. The verdict was guilty on all counts. Judge Richard Brennan was sentenced to life in federal prison without possibility of parole. The judge who pronounced sentence, a no-nonsense woman named Margaret Torres who had no relation to the corrupt officer, made a point of noting the irony. "You spent years abusing your power to send innocent people to prison," she said to Brennan as he stood before her in shackles. "Now you will experience firsthand what you inflicted on them, and unlike the women you victimized, you actually deserve to be there." Malcolm Durant received multiple consecutive life sentences. Beck and Torres, in exchange for their cooperation, received 20 and 25 years respectively. They would eventually be released, but not until they were old men who'd lost the best years of their lives to federal incarceration. But the prosecutions were only the beginning. The real work was the systematic review of every case that had passed through Brennan's courtroom. Diana assembled a task force of attorneys, investigators, and victim advocates. They worked 16-hour days, reviewing transcripts, re-interviewing witnesses, tracking down women who'd been convicted and scattered across the prison system. 47 wrongful convictions were identified, 47 women who'd been sent to prison on fabricated evidence. The exoneration process began immediately, though some cases were more complicated than others. Some women had already served their full sentences and been released. Some had died in prison, like Mary. But every single one would have their records cleared, their names restored, their suffering acknowledged. The day that Mama G walked out of the Riverside Women's Detention Center was sunny and warm, the first real day of spring after a long, cold winter. Diana was there to meet her, along with Gloria Henderson's daughter and 3 grandchildren who she hadn't seen in person for 15 years. Mama G stood on the steps, blinking in the sunlight, her hands shaking as she held the papers that officially exonerated her and expunged her record. "I never thought I'd see this day," she said, tears streaming down her face as her grandchildren wrapped around her in a hug that looked like it might never end. 15 years. 15 years I lost." "I know," Diana said quietly, "and nothing can give you back that time. But what we can give you is justice, acknowledgement, and whatever support you need to rebuild your life." Mama G looked at her with eyes that held both profound sadness and unexpected hope. "Your sister would be proud of you, you know. Mary, she'd be so proud." Diana had to turn away for a moment, overwhelmed by emotion she'd been holding back for months. "I hope so. I really hope so." James Janet took the news of Diana's true identity better than she'd expected. After the initial shock wore off, he'd thrown himself into the exoneration work with the same fierce dedication he'd shown in defending Destiny Williams. Diana offered him a position, director of the newly formed Public Defender's Office Reform Initiative, funded by federal grants, and the seized assets from Durant's criminal empire. "We're going to build a model," Diana explained to him over coffee 6 months after the trial. "A public defender's office that actually has the resources to fight for its clients. Reasonable caseloads, dedicated investigators, expert witnesses, everything that the current system denies to people who can't afford private attorneys." Chen accepted immediately. "I've been wanting to do something like this for years. I just never imagined it would actually be possible." "It's possible now," Diana said, "because sometimes you have to break a system completely before you can rebuild it the right way." The impact rippled outward. Other cities began reviewing their own court systems, looking for similar patterns of corruption. Several judges quietly retired when they saw federal investigators start asking questions. Police departments implemented new protocols for body camera use and evidence handling. It wasn't perfect, and there was still a long way to go, but change had begun. 2 years after Judge Brennan's arrest, Diana stood in front of a newly constructed building in the Riverside district. The sign above the entrance read, "Mary Cole Center for Justice and Advocacy." Inside were offices for attorneys providing free legal services, counselors specializing in trauma recovery, housing specialists helping women find stable living situations, and job training programs designed to provide real opportunities for people who'd been failed by the system. At the dedication ceremony, Diana gave a brief speech that was carried on local news. "My sister Mary died believing that the justice system had failed her. She was right, it did fail her. It failed her and hundreds of other women like her. But today we're taking a step toward ensuring that those failures never happen again. This center exists to serve the women that society has made invisible, to give voice to the voiceless, to provide hope to those who've been told they don't matter. Mary's life was stolen from her, but her death will not be meaningless. This center is her legacy, and it will stand as long as there are people who believe that justice means something. The crowd applauded, but Diana wasn't finished. She gestured to a woman standing off to the side, someone most people wouldn't have noticed. I also want to introduce someone special. This is Gloria Henderson, known to many as Mama G. She spent 15 years wrongfully imprisoned, 15 years stolen from her by the same corrupt system that took my sister. Now she's the center's director of peer support services, because nobody understands the trauma of wrongful conviction better than someone who's lived through it. Mama G stepped forward, her voice steady despite the emotion obvious on her face. For 15 years, I told myself to survive, to get through each day, to not give up hope even when hope seemed impossible. And now I get to help other women not just survive, but thrive. That's justice. That's real justice. Diana caught sight of James Janet in the crowd, surrounded by his team of public defenders who now had the resources to actually defend their clients. She saw several of the exonerated women, now free and rebuilding their lives. She saw FBI agents who'd worked on Operation Sister's Keeper, including Jennifer Park, who'd been promoted to assistant director. And she saw faces of women who'd been rescued from Durant's trafficking operation, some of them now working at the center, transforming their trauma into purpose. That evening, after the ceremony had ended and the crowds had dispersed, Diana drove to the Riverside Cemetery. She walked through rows of modest headstones until she found the one she was looking for. Mary Cole. Beloved daughter, sister, friend. The dates that marked a life cut tragically short. Diana knelt down and placed fresh flowers against the stone. "We did it, Mary," she said quietly. "Brennan's in prison. Durant's in prison. All of them are paying for what they did. And we built something good from what they destroyed. The center opened today. It's got your name on it, and it's going to help so many women. I wish you could see it. I wish you could be here." The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Diana sat on the grass next to her sister's grave and let herself cry, really cry, for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun. Tears for Mary, tears for all the women who'd suffered, tears of exhaustion and relief and grief and triumph all mixed together, but also tears of hope, because the system had been corrupt, but it had been exposed. Justice had been delayed, but it had not been denied. Women who'd been invisible had been seen. Voices that had been silenced had been heard. And in a federal prison 200 miles away, former Judge Richard Brennan sat in a cell that measured 8 feet by 10 feet. He wore an orange jumpsuit identical to the ones he'd sent thousands of people to wear. He ate food from plastic trays that tasted like paste. He was strip-searched by guards who didn't care about his former position or his complaints. He was just another inmate, number 79281, and he would be for the rest of his natural life. One afternoon in the prison yard, an older black man approached Brennan where he sat alone on a bench. The man's face was lined with age and hard years, but his eyes were sharp and knowing. "You don't remember me, do you?" the man said. Brennan looked up with irritation. "I don't know you. Leave me alone." "Oh, but you do know me. I'm case number 3478. You sentenced me 15 years ago for drug possession, evidence that your pet cops planted on me. I was innocent, Judge, just like I told you in my statement before sentencing. But you didn't care. You gave me the maximum, told me I was a parasite on society." Brennan's face went pale with recognition and fear. "I got exonerated 6 months ago," the man continued. "My record cleared, compensation paid. But I chose to stay in the system, transferred here actually, because I wanted to be able to look you in the eye and tell you something. Everything you did to me, to my family, to all those women, you're going to experience yourself now. Every indignity, every violation, every moment of powerlessness. And there's not a damn thing you can do about it. That's justice, Judge, real justice." The man walked away, leaving Brennan alone with the crushing weight of his new reality. This was his life now. This would be his life until the day he died. And unlike the women he'd victimized, he actually deserved every second of it. Diana Cole went on to become the director of the FBI, the first black woman to hold that position. She used her platform to push for reforms across the entire criminal justice system, working with legislators to pass laws that increased accountability for corrupt officials and provided more resources for public defenders. She became a national voice on issues of wrongful convictions, systemic racism, and the intersection of gender and justice. But she never forgot where she'd been. Every year on the anniversary of Mary's death, she visited that grave and renewed her promise to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves, to give voice to the voiceless, to ensure that no other woman would have to endure what Mary had endured. The scales of justice, which had been so badly tilted for so long, began to balance again. Not perfectly, not everywhere. But in Riverside, in the courtrooms where Judge Brennan had once ruled like a tyrant, things were different now. Public defenders had resources. Judges faced real oversight. Body cameras couldn't be conveniently disabled. And women who entered the system weren't automatically assumed to be guilty just because they were poor, black, and powerless. Change was slow. Change was hard. But change was happening. And somewhere, Diana liked to believe, Mary was watching and smiling and proud of the sister who'd kept her promise. The story of Operation Sister's Keeper became a case study in law schools across the country. Students analyzed the tactics Diana had used, the legal implications of her deep cover operation, the balance between individual sacrifice and systemic change. Some praised her courage. Others questioned whether the ends justified the means, but nobody could deny that she'd accomplished something extraordinary. She'd walked willingly into hell, endured everything that system could throw at her, and emerged with enough evidence to bring down an entire corrupt empire. She'd sacrificed her safety, her comfort, and her freedom for 12 weeks to ensure that justice would be served. And in doing so, she'd proven something important, that no one is above the law. Not judges, not police officers, not crime bosses, not anyone. The gavel that Judge Richard Brennan had wielded as a weapon for so many years now sat in a display case at FBI headquarters, a reminder of the operation that had exposed one of the most extensive judicial corruption schemes in American history. A plaque beneath it read, "Dedicated to Mary Cole and all the women whose voices were silenced by a corrupt system. May we never forget what happens when power goes unchecked, and may we always have the courage to challenge injustice wherever we find it." Diana visited that display case sometimes, when the weight of her responsibilities as director felt particularly heavy. She would stand there and remember who she'd been when this all started, a grieving sister determined to find answers, who she'd become in the process, Destiny Williams, powerless and afraid, and who she'd revealed herself to be, Deputy Director Diana Cole, the woman who'd brought down a judge. All three of those women were real. All three were her. And all three had been necessary to achieve what seemed impossible. As she left the building one evening, her phone buzzed with a text from Mama G. "Just wanted you to know we helped our 500th client today at the center. Mary would be proud. I'm proud. Thank you for everything." Diana smiled, typed back a response, and looked up at the sky where the first stars were beginning to appear in the twilight. "We did it, Mary," she whispered. "We really did it." And somewhere in the great unknown, she liked to imagine Mary smiling back and saying what she'd always said when they were kids and had accomplished something together. "I knew you could do it, sis. I always knew." Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice pursued with courage, truth, and an unwavering commitment to what's right will always, eventually, prevail. For every woman whose voice was silenced, whose story was dismissed, whose life was stolen by a corrupt system, this one's for you. If this story hit you in the chest, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone you love, a sister, a brother, a friend, a partner, anyone who needs a reminder that truth can still win and that no one is too small to matter. You never know who's quietly carrying their own Mary right now and might need to hear that justice is still possible. And if you believe stories like this should be told loud, clear, and unignored, tap the share button, send it to your people, and keep the conversation alive. We'll see you in the next one.